Bring the coffee, dispatcher. The voice cut through the boardroom like a rusty blade. That was Luther Kane, 54 years old, with a tan that screamed expensive golf memberships and the kind of smirk that made you want to introduce his face to a concrete wall. I'm Bryce Sullivan, 47 years old, and I wasn't just the dispatcher. I was the operations coordinator who'd spent 8 years coordinating convoy supply lines in Iraq before coming home to help my old man run Sullivan Freight Lines. But to Luther and his collection of corporate parasites, I was just Frank's boy who couldn't hack it in the real world. I set the coffee down with the precision of a man who'd disarmed IEDs for a living. Right here, Mr. Kane. Now go sit in the back where you belong. Luther waved me off without looking up from his phone. Adults are talking business here. I walked past the mahogany table that cost more than most of our drivers made in a year and took my spot on a metal folding chair against the wall. The same spot where I'd been watching this slow-motion train wreck for the past 14 months. Let me set the record straight. Sullivan Freight Lines wasn't some corporate giant. We were a mid-sized trucking operation with 320 drivers, 180 rigs, and a reputation built on 47 years of on-time deliveries. My father, Frank Sullivan, started this company in 1978 with one beat-up Peterbilt and a promise to haul anything anywhere. He built it into the backbone of logistics for half the Midwest. Dad died 18 months ago. Cancer got him, but not before he saw what was coming. In his final weeks, he called me into his office, the same cramped space above the dispatch floor where he'd run everything with a CB radio and a handshake. "They're going to come for it, son," he wheezed, pointing at the framed photos of drivers and their families that covered every wall. Luther thinks he's slick with all his MBA talk about synergy and optimization, but I've seen his type before. They don't build anything. They just strip the copper wire and sell it for scrap. The old man had been watching Luther for months, seeing through the consultant act. Dad knew predators when he saw them. He'd fought off plenty of corporate raiders over the years, guys who wanted to buy him out and gut the operation. But Luther was different. Luther had worked his way inside like a cancer. Dad handed me a thick folder marked Estate Planning, Confidential. Inside was something Luther didn't know existed. Blue Steel Holdings, LLC, a shell company that held 53% of Sullivan Freight Lines. The voting shares weren't in some trust managed by the board. They were mine, waiting for the right moment. "Don't fight them like a soldier, Bryce," Dad said, his voice getting weaker by the day. "Fight them like a logistics officer. Control the supply lines. Control the battlefield." I'd joined the company 12 years ago, fresh out of the Army at 35. Spent my first 2 years learning every job on the floor, dispatch, maintenance, even drove routes. During the busy season, Dad insisted on it. "You can't run what you don't understand," he'd say. By the time he made me operations coordinator, I knew every driver by name, every route by heart, every weakness in our system. But I also knew every strength. And our biggest strength was loyalty. These drivers weren't just employees, they were family. Big Jim Rodriguez had driven 2 million miles without an accident. Sarah Bell worked nights so she could take care of her disabled son during the day. Tommy Walsh, Kevin's older brother, had been with us since he was 18, worked his way up from lot sweeper to fleet manager. Luther saw numbers. I saw people. Back in the boardroom, Luther was putting on his show. "Gentlemen, the numbers don't lie. We're hemorrhaging money on fuel costs, driver wages, and equipment maintenance. The solution is obvious. We need to partner with Mega Haul Logistics." Garrett Bell, the oldest board member and one of Dad's original investors, raised his hand. Garrett was 78, a Korean War vet who still drove himself to meetings in a 1987 Buick. He'd put his life savings into Dad's company back in 1982 when everyone said trucking was a dead-end business. "Luther, partnering sounds nice, but what are we really talking about?" "Efficiency, Garrett. Mega Haul will take over our routes with their newer, more fuel-efficient fleet. We'll transition from asset-heavy to asset-light logistics management. Translation: sell our trucks, fire our drivers, and rent everything back at triple the cost while Luther pockets the difference. The oldest trick in the corporate playbook." "What about our guys?" Garrett pressed. "Some of these drivers have been with Frank for 25 years. Luther's smile was colder than a Minnesota winter. "Look, I get the emotional attachment, but we can't run a charity. The drivers who adapt will find opportunities. The rest, well, that's business evolution." Evolution. Like firing 320 people was natural selection. I was taking notes, but not the kind Luther thought. Every word was going into a file that would eventually hang him. For 14 months, I'd been watching this corporate vampire drain the company my father built. The $95,000 executive retreat to Aspen while our mechanics worked with duct-taped equipment. The $180,000 in consulting fees paid to Apex Logistics Solutions, a company that existed only as a P.O. box in Delaware and Luther's personal bank account. Luther thought he was untouchable because he controlled the board. Quincy Romano and Roderick Brooks, two guys who joined after Dad got sick, followed Luther like trained seals. They'd vote for anything as long as their quarterly bonuses kept coming. "The motion is on the table," Luther announced. "All in favor of the Mega Hall partnership agreement?" Hands went up. Romano, Brooks, even CFO Nolan Pierce, who knew the real numbers but was too scared to speak up. Nolan had been Dad's accountant for 15 years, good with numbers, terrible with confrontation. Garrett? Luther stared at the old veteran. "I need time to think," Garrett said slowly. "Think fast. We vote next Friday. I've got Mega Hall's people flying in." Luther stood up, checking his Rolex. Meeting adjourned. As they filed out, Luther caught my eye. "Hey, dispatcher, make sure the coffee's fresh for next week. We're going to be celebrating." I stayed in my metal chair until the room emptied. Then I pulled out my phone and scrolled through photos I'd been taking of Luther's computer screen during lunch breaks. 8 months of careful documentation. Email after email to Mega Hall executives discussing not just buying our routes, but liquidating our equipment for pennies on the dollar. One email made my blood run cold. "Jim, we're good to proceed. The board vote is locked. After we sell the fleet, I'm looking at a $2 million consulting bonus for facilitating the transition. The local yokels won't know what hit them." Local yokels. That's what he called the drivers who'd been loyal to my family for decades. Men like Big Jim Rodriguez, who'd driven 2 million miles without an accident and still sent Christmas cards to the office every year. Women like Sarah Bell, who'd worked nights so she could take care of her disabled son during the day and never missed a delivery deadline. To Luther, they were just numbers to be erased. Overhead to be eliminated. But to me, they were the reason Dad built this company in the first place. That night, I drove to Mel's Diner on Route 80, the same place where drivers had been stopping for coffee and gossip since Dad started the company. The parking lot was full of our rigs, drivers grabbing hot meals and cold beer before hitting the road again. This was the real Sullivan Freight Lines, not the boardroom theater Luther preferred. Sitting in a corner booth was Vivian Sullivan, no relation, just shared the name, whose husband Earl had driven for us for 25 years before a heart attack took him last winter. She held 0.3% of company stock, a token gift Dad gave to long-term employees back when the company went public in small percentages to reward loyalty. "Bryce, honey," she smiled, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had seen better days. "You look tired." "Long day, Mrs. Sullivan. Did you bring the paper?" She slid a proxy form across the Formica table. The paper was already worn from being folded and unfolded, evidence of her struggle with the decision. "That Mr. Kane called me again yesterday. Said if I didn't sell my shares to him, they'd be worthless by Christmas." "He's lying," I said. "Your shares are about to be worth a lot more." Her eyes searched mine, looking for something to believe in. "Earl always said your daddy was the only honest man in trucking," she said, signing the proxy with shaking hands. "Said Frank Sullivan would never let his drivers down no matter what." "Dad's gone, Mrs. Sullivan. But I'm not. You go get him, son." The next morning I was in the office at 5 a.m., not in my dispatcher cubicle, but in the server room. Kevin Walsh, our IT guy, was a 24-year-old who communicated mostly through energy drinks and headphone music. He was also former Navy, which meant he understood the concept of operational security and the value of keeping his mouth shut when needed. "Kevin," I said, sliding him a cup of coffee that was actually decent for once. "Luther's been complaining about the boardroom projector flickering again." Kevin frowned, pulling one earbud out. "It's brand new. I tested it last week. Ran full diagnostics." "Yeah, but you know how he is about technology. Maybe take it down for maintenance until after the meeting Friday? Better safe than sorry, right?" Kevin studied my face for a moment. Navy intelligence training doesn't just disappear when you take off the uniform. He could sense there was more to this request than Luther's standard tech paranoia about equipment failures. "If I pull it for diagnostics, I'll need to order a replacement part from the vendor," he said slowly. "Won't be ready until Monday at the earliest. That's probably for the best. We can't afford any technical difficulties during such an important presentation." Kevin nodded, silent understanding passing between us without unnecessary words. I'll take it down after lunch today. Make sure everything's working perfectly for next week's meeting. Without his fancy PowerPoint presentation, Luther would have to rely on paper handouts, and people actually read paper handouts. They notice things like fine print that says Mega Hall gets our client list, our warehouses, and exclusive rights to our routes for the next 15 years. They see clauses about workforce optimization and operational streamlining that sound nice until you realize they mean firing everyone who's built their life around this company for decades. But taking down the projector was just the opening tactical move in a larger operation. The real strategic game was happening in cyberspace, where Luther had absolutely no idea he was being systematically outflanked by a guy he thought was too stupid to understand corporate strategy. Friday morning came like a freight train. I was in the office at 6 a.m., not nervous, but focused on real work. I walked to the dispatch floor, checking night crews, ensuring our drivers had clear routes. This was what Dad built. Not a boardroom empire, but a working operation moving America's goods from point A to point B. Tommy Walsh was finishing his shift, updating route boards. "Morning, Bryce. Big meeting today?" "Could be," I said. "How's the fleet?" "Like clockwork. Sarah's hauling medical equipment to Denver. Big Jim's got steel for Indianapolis. 0 breakdowns." He paused. "Luther doesn't see this. Just spreadsheets with red numbers." "Luther sees what he wants to see," I said. "Always has." At 9:45, I walked into that boardroom carrying a red folder Luther wouldn't see coming. I'd organized 14 months of evidence, bank records, email screenshots, expense reports that would make a forensic accountant weep. The board members filed, in like mourners at a funeral they were planning to profit from. Romano checked his phone. Brooks adjusted his tie. Nolan Pierce carried financial reports, his face pale. Luther swaggered in last, wearing a suit that probably cost more than our best driver made in a month. He was practically glowing with anticipated victory. "All right, gentlemen," Luther announced. "Today we make history. Mega Hall is ready to—" He stopped, staring at the blank wall where his projector screen should be. "Where's my presentation setup?" "Technical difficulties, sir," I said from my metal chair. "It is working on it." Luther's face turned the color of brake fluid. "This is amateur hour. We'll have to use paper copies." He started distributing his glossy handouts, each one a nail in his coffin. I watched the board members flip through the documents. Garrett's eyebrows rose as he read the fine print. Nolan's hands were shaking slightly. Even Romano and Brooks looked uncomfortable as they realized what they were actually voting for. "Before we begin," a voice said from the back of the room. Everyone turned. It was me, standing up with my red folder. "Bryce," Luther sneered. "We're in the middle of—" "Point of order, Mr. Kane." My voice was steady, the same tone I'd used calling an air support in Fallujah. "As a shareholder, I'm invoking my right to address this board." "You're the dispatcher," Romano laughed nervously. "You don't own stock." I walked to the front of the room and slid a document across the table to Luther. It spun across the polished surface like a death warrant, coming to rest directly in front of his coffee cup. "That," I said, "is a notarized declaration of voting rights representing 53.3% of Sullivan Freight Lines, including shares held by Blue Steel Holdings, employee proxy agreements, and Mrs. Sullivan's estate contribution." The room went silent. Luther picked up the paper with shaking hands, his tan fading to the color of old mayonnaise. His eyes scanned the legal text, looking for some loophole, some way out of the trap he'd walked into. This is fraud," he stammered. "You can't just—" "I can," I said, and I did. Blue Steel Holdings has been the majority shareholder since my father's death. You just never bothered to check who actually owned it. Garrett Bell was grinning like he'd just won the Kentucky Derby. "I believe the young man has the floor, Luther. Now," I continued, opening my red folder, "let's talk about your performance as CEO. Item 1. The $180,000 paid to Apex Logistics Solutions, a company that exists only in your imagination and your bank account. I slid the first batch of documents across the table. Bank statements, wire transfer receipts, incorporation papers for the shell company. Luther's face went from pale to green. Those were legitimate consulting fees. Item 2, I interrupted. The $95,000 Aspen retreat where you secured exactly 0 new contracts but did secure a very nice tan and what I assume was an expensive hangover. More documents hit the table. Hotel receipts, lift ticket purchases, restaurant bills that would feed a driver's family for months. Item 3, I said, pulling out printed emails. Your communications with Megahall discussing not just selling our routes, but liquidating our equipment and firing our drivers for what you called a consulting bonus of $2 million. The emails landed with the weight of evidence. Luther's own words, in black and white, discussing the destruction of everything my father had built. Brooks looked ready to crawl under the table. Romano was studying his fingernails like they held the secrets of the universe. Nolan Pierce had stopped pretending to shuffle papers and was staring at Luther with something approaching horror. "This is a witch hunt," Luther shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "I saved this company. The fuel costs, the regulations, the fuel costs you inflated by buying from your brother-in-law's distributorship at 15% above market rate?" I asked, sliding another document across the table. "The regulations you violated by cutting our maintenance budget to fund your bonuses?" Luther's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Every accusation came with documentation. Every crime had evidence. The OSHA violations you covered up, the environmental reports you falsified, the pension fund contributions you delayed. More papers hit the table. Luther's corruption, documented and undeniable. I looked around at the men who'd enabled this theft. "Gentlemen, you have a choice. Vote with me to remove Mr. Kane for cause, or explain to the Department of Transportation why you've been signing off on falsified inspection reports." The silence stretched like a long haul across Kansas on a hot summer night. Luther looked around the room desperately, searching for allies who were suddenly very interested in studying their shoes and avoiding eye contact. "Motion to remove Luther Kane as CEO and chairman, effective immediately," I said clearly. "Do I have a second?" "Second," Garrett said, his voice strong as steel and unwavering. "All in favor of the motion?" My hand went up first, then Garrett's. Nolan Pierce, quiet for 14 months, slowly raised his hand. Then Brooks, reading the writing on the wall. Finally, Romano lifted his hand reluctantly. "Unanimous," I announced. "Luther, you're done." Luther stood there, mouth opening and closing like a gasping fish. The color had drained from his face completely. "You can't run this company," he whispered. "You're just a dispatcher." "No," I said, walking around the table to Dad's old chair. "I'm a logistics coordinator who spent 8 years moving supplies through war zones. And this company isn't going anywhere except forward." I sat down in the leather chair. It was still warm from Luther's body heat, but it felt like coming home. The weight of 45 years of history settled on my shoulders, but it felt right. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items," I said. "1 box, supervised. No files, no electronics." Luther looked around the room one last time, searching for sympathy that wasn't coming. "You'll run it into the ground," he said desperately. "Maybe," I replied, "but at least our drivers will have jobs while I'm learning." 20 minutes later, I watched Luther walk to his Porsche carrying a cardboard box. He threw it into the passenger seat, got in, and peeled out, nearly clipping a delivery truck. The truck driver laid on his horn, a satisfying farewell salute. After Luther left, I looked at the remaining board members. They were waiting to see if executions would continue. "Here's the new reality," I said. "No more corporate retreats. No more consulting fees to imaginary companies. Brooks, Romano, you're staying because firing the entire board would spook the banks. But you're on probation." They nodded like bobbleheads, relief washing over their faces. I turned to Nolan Pierce. "Nolan, you're interim CFO. First order of business, driver raises. Second, new maintenance budget. Third, profit sharing for everyone who's been here more than 5 years. Nolan's eyes widened. "Profit sharing? But the margins?" "We'll improve when we stop bleeding money to phantom consultants," I said. "Run the numbers. Show me what we're actually working with once we cut out the cancer." "What about the Megahall deal?" Brooks asked nervously. "Dead. Buried. We're not selling to anyone. We're a trucking company, and we're going to keep trucking." Over the next several hours, word spread through the building faster than gossip at a busy truck stop. Drivers called in from the road, mechanics emerged from under hoods, office staff gathered in small, excited groups. The mood was electric, like the moment after a thunderstorm when the air finally clears and you can breathe again. Tommy Walsh was the first to find me in Dad's office. He knocked on the doorframe, grinning wider than I'd seen him smile in years. So it's actually true? Luther's really gone for good? Gone, I confirmed. Drove off in his fancy car about an hour ago. Tommy let out a whoop that could probably be heard 3 states over. The boys are talking about throwing a celebration party at Mel's tonight. You should definitely come. I'll be there, I said. First round's on the company. 3 months later, I'm sitting in this same chair looking out at our dispatch floor where drivers are picking up their assigned routes for the day. The morning rush has that same energy it had when Dad was running things. Organized chaos with a clear purpose. We're not getting rich, but we're profitable. Turns out, when you stop paying consultants to tell you how to run your own business, the numbers improve dramatically. Our safety ratings are up, our delivery times are down, and nobody's getting laid off to fund some executive's yacht payment. Nolan Pierce has grown into the CFO role like he was born for it. Turns out he'd been keeping 2 sets of books for months, one that Luther wanted to see and one that showed what was really happening. The real numbers weren't nearly as bad as Luther had been claiming to justify his theft. The profit-sharing program launched last month. Drivers who've been with us for over 5 years got checks that made Christmas come early. Sarah Bell cried when she opened hers. Big Jim Rodriguez called it the best bonus he'd gotten in 20 years. These are the moments Dad would have lived for. Luther Kane? Last I heard through the industry grapevine, he's consulting for a crypto logistics startup in Miami. Apparently, they're revolutionizing freight with blockchain technology and artificial intelligence. Good luck to them. Give it 6 months before they realize their revolutionary consultant is just a corporate vampire with an expensive suit and empty promises. The coffee machine in the break room still works the same way it did when I was bringing Luther his morning dose of arrogance. But these days, I make my own coffee. Tastes better when you're not serving it to someone who thinks you're invisible. Dad was right about logistics being about controlling the supply lines. But he taught me something Luther never understood. The most important supply line isn't money or expensive equipment. It's respect. You respect your drivers, they'll move mountains for you. You treat them like disposable parts, and eventually they'll find someone who values what they do. I still work dispatch sometimes, talking to drivers on long hauls, making sure they have what they need to get the job done safely and efficiently, because that's what this business is really about. Getting the job done 1 mile at a time, 1 delivery at a time, 1 satisfied customer at a time. And if some corporate hotshot thinks he can waltz in and strip our company for parts while treating our good people like dirt, well, let's just say I've got plenty of coffee to serve, and I know exactly where each cup belongs properly. Some lessons are best served hot and memorable. The end.